Welcome to another video, guys. In this one, I'm going to be talking about the new amulet in the Crucible League, the Tainted Pact. This amulet is really interesting as a modifier on it that says taking chaos damage over time heals you instead while leeching life. There was a lot of discussion in the community about this amulet when it was first teased just before League launch. People were talking about using this amulet with things like self-poison with the golden rule jewel. That's a really cool concept. As long as your leech duration is at least slightly longer than your poison duration, you'll have like this ramping recovery effect, which is really nice. There's also people talking about the usage of this amulet with the Forbidden Taste Flask, since the flask kind of provides a constant degen effect usually that takes chaos damage. This will just provide instead a constant recovery to you, which is really nice. But I think the most interesting use case for this amulet is, of course, in combination with Divine Flesh. When you have the right setup here, you'll actually be able to effectively ignore elemental damage over time. Now, this is really interesting because the most tanky builds in the game typically struggle with damage over time. It's sometimes the only real weakness of a setup, and that's because it's generally quite difficult to obtain significant upgrades to your defense against damage over time. It's worth noting that this setup won't give you anything against bleeding, which is arguably one of the most dangerous damage over time effects in the game. But you can always use things like the Radikesh Pantheon, which significantly improves your survivability against bleeding, or you can get bleed immunity from various sources. There's even the new armor and evasion mastery that will make you immune to bleeding if your helmet has more armor than evasion. And then corrupted blood can be dealt with pretty easily through the mastery or like a duel with a corrupted implicit, so that you can't be inflicted with corrupted blood. And you could always just use a bleed flask as well. There's that option there too. There's also the shield Apex Supremacy. Now this one's been around. It's an incursion exclusive shield. This one makes you take chaos damage instead of physical damage from bleeding. Now, that's really interesting with this amulet because, as I said, bleeding is extremely dangerous. So if you're to use it with this amulet, you'll essentially be able to turn those really dangerous bleeds into massive heals for yourself. So that's quite nice as well. But anyway, in this video, the main topic is elemental damage over time, because as I mentioned before, the combination of this new amulet with Divine Flesh can actually make you essentially immune to elemental damage over time. This is because you can make it so that you're taking exactly the same amount of damage as you are healing from it, and that means they kind of cancel each other out. So it's worth noting that this can only work if you have a reliable way of leeching life, as that's kind of the downside of this modifier on the amulet. You have to be leeching life for this to actually even work in the first place. You're going to need Overleech, and there's a few places you can get Overleech. The most notable one, of course, is the Slayer and the Ascendant Slayer. Both of those ascendancies have access to Overleech. You can get it through the Immortal Ambition Keystone. That one can be acquired from the Soul Tether Belt. There's also the gloves, the offering to the Serpent gloves that drop from Venarius in the Cortex. That one's kind of a bit lackluster because they have a downside on those that make your leech duration a lot lower, so I wouldn't recommend that one. And of course you can get overleached by using Petrified Blood with your life at the maximum recoverable amount of 50% or 55% if you're using the new low life mastery. As long as you're not reserving your life below that threshold, you'll have access to Overleech from that as long as you're hitting and you have Leech. So once you have Overleech, you can be sure that the amulet's buff is going to be active as long as you're leeching. And so we're going to combine this amulet with Divine Flesh. Now, Divine Flesh is a keystone. It can be acquired from the Glorious Vanity Jewel from Legion or from the Mahuzotul's Machination Shield. And this keystone makes it so that you take 50% of elemental damage as chaos damage, and importantly, this effect also works for damage over time. And half of the elemental damage that you take as chaos damage will actually heal you as long as you are leeching, but it's really important to understand that this heal is subject to damage mitigation, because of course it was damage before it was converted to heal. So the chaos damage that you take will first go through your resistances, and then it will also be reduced by anything else that will affect damage that you take before it actually gets converted to healing. So for example, if you were a Slayer and the Slayer has 10% reduced damage taken while leeching, then the chaos damage that you take is going to first go through your resistances, and then it's going to be reduced by that percentage as well, and then it will be converted into healing. So importantly, Divine Flesh provides +5 to maximum chaos resistance. So as a baseline, we're going to have 75% of each maximum elemental resistance and 80% maximum chaos resistance. This means that whenever you take elemental damage over time, you'll still be taking more damage than you are healing, because the chaos damage would be mitigated by the 80%, and the elemental damage would be mitigated by the 75%, and therefore you're healing slightly less than you're taking. So we need to make it so that we're taking the same amount of elemental damage as we are chaos damage, so these two effects cancel each other out. Now we can do this by balancing out our maximum resistances. So we need to essentially make up those elemental resistances to be the same as the chaos resistance that you gain from Divine Flesh. This is considerably easier on the left-hand side of the passive skill tree. You can take the full prismatic skin wheel for +3 to all maximum elemental resistances, and then the soul of steel wheel for another +1. And the last +1 can come from the reservation mastery if you're reserving life and mana, or from the armor mastery if all of your gear has armor. There's some other ways to get +1 max as well. There's even a Crucible Shield modifier that gives you +1 or +2 to all maximum elemental resistances and -5 to maximum chaos resistance, but I don't really recommend that one. That one's not a great trade-off, especially when you're using Divine Flesh. And you have to remember that, you know, this is for hits as well, so you don't really want to be taking damage as chaos and then that damage is being mitigated with a lower resistance. So let's take the example where we have 80% all maximum resistances. So we've managed to gain enough elemental resistances to match our 80% chaos resistance, and we have 80% all resistances. We're using the Tainted Pact amulet with Divine Flesh, and we're currently leeching life. We stand in the Uber Shaper Beam, which deals about 20,000 elemental damage per second. It's a mix of cold and fire. 50% of the damage is taken normally for our elemental resistances, so 10,000 damage reduced to 2,000 damage over time taken per second. The other 50% is taken as chaos, which goes through our chaos resistance, which is also 80%, reducing it to 2,000 damage taken per second. However, this half of the damage is converted to healing due to Tainted Pact, so we're now healing for 2,000 life per second whilst taking 2,000 damage per second, and these two perfectly cancel each other out. Now, this is great in theory. It's just an incredible mechanic to be able to ignore elemental damage over time effects, especially the ground effects during boss fights such as the Maven or Ubelda. It's an extremely strong mechanic to have, but Leech can become quite unreliable, especially against bosses with phases and things where the boss moves around and you can't hit something for a duration of time, so you're unable to keep your Leech up, and then your Leech just falls off, right? Slayer is a little bit more reliable for this. They have 100% increased maximum recovery per life leech modifier on Brutal Fervor. This increases the duration of the leech instance from 5 seconds to 10 seconds, so it's less likely that your leech falls off, but it's still possible. But there is a way to have reliable leech. This is by using the Flask modifier on a character that can sustain Flask. This Flask modifier, it comes from the Katarina, you need to unveil it, but it makes it so 15% of damage you take from hits is leeched as life. As long as you have the Flask active, any hits that you take are going to begin to leech as life. And this even works for self-damage, so things that hit you, that you cause to hit yourself, so things like Forbidden Rite, or the damage from the Heartbound Loop Ring, or Skull's Bridal Helmet. All these things hit you for damage, and that hit will cause a leech instance when you're using this Flask modifier. Now that's really good because you can actually maintain leech and make sure leech is active all the time, even when there's no enemies around to actually hit. But there's more though, because if you're using this setup, you already have a character that can maintain Flask, so that's the whole point of using this setup. Which means that you'll be able to use the Ruby, Sapphire and Topaz Flask and have them up all the time, and those provide damage reduction. So we actually won't need to solve the max resistances problem from earlier, because these flasks are going to solve that problem for us. Let's take the same example from earlier. So this time we have just the base 75% maximum elemental resistances, and we've got the 80% maximum chaos resistance because we're using Divine Flesh. Once again, we're using the Tainted Pact amulet, and we're leeching life. But this time we have the Ruby, Sapphire and Topaz Flasks active. These all provide a baseline 20% less damage taken for their respective element, and importantly, this also affects damage over time. So once again, we're taking 20,000 damage over time per second. It's elemental damage. 50% of the damage is taken normally through our elemental resistance, so 10,000 damage reduced to 2,500 damage, which is then reduced further by the less damage taken modifier on the Flask, bringing it down to 2,000 damage taken per second. The other 50% is taken as chaos because of Divine Flesh, which goes through our chaos resistance, So it's reduced to 2000 damage over time taken per second, which is converted to 2000 life healed per second from the Tainted Pact. Once again, these two perfectly cancel each other out. It's worth knowing here that any modifiers that increase or reduce the damage you take will impact how much you heal for. For example, if you were shocked, increasing all the damage you are taking, and the damage over time that would be taken as chaos is also increased, therefore the healing that you receive is increased. But the exception to this rule is when a modifier changes the amount of damage you take of a particular type. So for example, the buff and debuff that you gain in the Black Star boss, which makes it so that you take more and less fire and cold damage, well, this would make you take more damage of a particular type of damage, so the damage that you take of that particular element would be increased, but this wouldn't impact the chaos portion of the damage you take. So in this instance, you would take more elemental damage than you're actually healing, because it would increase that part of the damage that you're taking, but it wouldn't increase the healing coming in from the chaos damage. You can even use this setup with Righteous Fire to just maintain Righteous Fire all the time without taking any damage. You can use it with the Uber Exarch boots, the Annihilation's approach. These boots are kind of weird. I mean, I don't really know the design of these. I'm not sure what they were going for here, but you basically just can't use these boots on anything, really. There's not many things that can actually maintain these boots and for it to actually be worthwhile, because even a build that has extreme amounts of recovery, you know, they're going to struggle with this one. But with this setup, you can just click the modifier on these boots. You take 10,000 fire damage over time per second, but you actually take nothing because you've got this setup, and you just have permanent adrenaline, so that's pretty cool. It's also worth mentioning that because you're using this setup and you're already really strong against damage over time and you're already using Divine Flesh, you may as well just put the 4th Vow body armor in there in that setup. With a decent amount of armor, you'll just be gaining a huge amount of mitigation against elemental hits too, so that's a great combination to use. And lastly, I'll just talk about Petrified Blood, because I did mention Petrified Blood earlier as a way to get over leech, and I think that's a great use in this mechanic, because the one big problem with Petrified Blood is that you are really weak against damage over time. The buff does nothing for damage over time, it only provides assistance against hits. So you become extremely weak to damage over time. You're basically losing around half of your life against damage over time. So if you're able to use this combination mechanics with Petrified Blood, that's a pretty good use case. Of course, you still got to be worried about a few damage over time effects, like physical damage over time, but as I said earlier, you can mitigate those through other ways. But yeah, what do you guys think of this setup? Is this a little bit too tricky to get this whole thing ironed out and get it set up in the first place, or are some of you guys already using this amulet? Let me know what you guys think down in the comment section below, and I hope you guys enjoy this video. As always, stay tuned and stay safe.